Marvel Snap's January cards look to me like there are some very big hits and some potential very large misses. Let's take a look at the Dark Avengers season in Marvel Snap. Per Datamines, the season pass card is Iron Patriot. Iron Patriot is a 2/3 with the ability to, on reveal, add a 4, 5, or 6 cost card at random from Marvel Snap to your hand. This is not a strong ability on its own, but luckily there is a second part to this text box. It says that card, if next turn you are winning Iron Patriot's location, gets discounted by 4, meaning a 4 cost card will cost 0, a 5 cost card will cost 1, a 6 cost card will cost 2. This card reminds me a lot of like a better version of Valentina. I think that's a reasonable comparison to make. Valentina is going to be a lot worse, though, because the discount is a lot less meaningful. Obviously, if you get a 6 cost card that costs 2, that's better than a 6 cost card that costs 4, which is what Valentina gives you. And this card does have an additional requirement on it, but that requirement isn't necessarily as hard to hit as you might think. I personally believe that this is a very, very strong card with the ability to be potentially a key card in many archetypes. I have very high hopes for this card. However, I can also envision worlds where it's not as good as we think. And so let's talk about where it's going to be good and where it's going to be bad. The success case for this card is it is like a Wiccan 2-drop banger, where it's just like one of the best cards in like your general described mid-range shell, where if you're just playing a lot of good cards on curve, this is not that far off from every other 2-cost card. You're playing stuff like Hawkeye and Jeff anyway, if you're looking for a list of good 2-cost cards on curve. So this is a 2/3 that adds something to your hand that is a long-standing, these are going to be pretty good kind of archetype of cards. And of course, you also have the ability to go a little bit overboard, because the thing this adds to your hand, if you're winning the location, is going to be way better than anything else any other card is ever going to add to your hand. For comparison's sake, let's take a look at like the average 5-drop, which I think is roughly in the range of like Adam Warlock. A 1-cost Adam Warlock is ridiculously powerful. That's not even a very good 5-drop. Everything that is going to be at the 4 and the 5 is basically going to be good for this. Now, the 6s are where things get a little bit weirder, because there's such a high percentage of very specific 6s. Like, if you get Destroyer, like, are you doing that? Are you willing to do that? There are some issues at the 6 slot, like games where Null does nothing, games where Destroyer is directly harmful. And generally, this card succeeds in a world where mid-range stuff is doing mid-range stuff. It reminds me a little bit of Anti-Venom in terms of, like, you put it in your mid-range deck and you're just cheating a little bit harder than the mid-range decks that aren't running it, because you have this high upside that is just available to you without really a cost in terms of the body of the card that you're actually playing, where Anti-Venom is a 4/7, this is a 2/3, you're very much fine with those bodies, and there's additional, like, way over-the-top upside if you get, like, a Claw that costs 1 or whatever, right? And so this is a card that I think makes the most sense in a world like that. It's a card that punishes bad draws extremely heavily, and I'll note a synergy that I'm not sure I've seen people talking about. There have been plenty of decks recently that are Quicksilver Wiccan decks playing Negasonic. A world in which you are able to go this into Negasonic with priority is a devastating one for your opponent, because they will try to contest this lane, they will have their thing blown up by Negasonic, you will get the discount. Very, very unique playline there that I think could be important to how this card ends up functioning in the long term. But there is a lot of competition if you're going to be I'm a 2-drop who is good in Wiccan. Like you have you have Kate Bishop, not Hope Summers. Sorry, I got my season pass cards mixed up. You have this card. You have Penny Parker, who hasn't come out yet at the time of recording of this video, but definitely is a 2 that makes a 3, which goes in every Wiccan deck. I think this card has a real shot at competing with any of those cards, and the upside on it is much higher than any of those cards, and that, to me, indicates that it is going to be a card that sticks around in that role until something better than it comes out, and I find it hard to believe that that thing actually exists. This is a powerful 2-drop that has massive upside, has some synergies built in with stuff like Negasonic. Really interesting card, and I think of all the cards in this month, this is the one that I'm the most sure is going to be metagame relevant. Victoria Hand's design is something that I see as a step forward for how Marvel Snap designs cards. She is a 2/3 with an ongoing ability that says cards created in your hand get +2 power. And the reason I think this is a step forward for how Marvel Snap designs cards is the way it's worded. Cards created in your hand. They're narrowing down on a subset of created cards. The way this reads, it should not work for cards created in your deck, like RSM cards or Thanos stones. And this is a lesson that I'm glad they learned. It was something that I wish they'd done for a card like Mockingbird, where Mockingbird very specifically keys off of cards that are not shield cards. Mockingbird is a shield agent. Her flavor is that she's supposed to go with the other shield cards. Instead, she has become a Thanos Stone card and an Arashim randomly generated card, and those are her main synergies in the game right now. With the notable exception of Mysterio, which also makes no flavorful sense. I remember when Mockingbird first came out, there was a big conversation about whether they should have just put, hey, Thanos Stones don't count on the text box here. And I remember thinking that they probably should have done this, but also thinking that it's basically sort of hack design to say, oh, you can't do it with this kind of thing. Whereas with Victoria Hand, I think this is a good execution of that concept that accomplishes the goals people wanted accomplished for Mockingbird, but doesn't necessarily say, like, literally, you can't play this with Thanos. But it does, in practice, say, no Thanos, no Arashim, no Mysterio. That's really good. That's just a very good thing to happen. As far as potential homes for this card, I mean, when I look at it, I see a couple cards that make a lot of sense with it. The first is Kate Bishop. A lot of stuff running Kate Bishop is very interested in a 2/3 that gives that stuff +2. And that might be enough to just see this card see play. Again, we talked about how 2/3 is actually kind of the standard stat line at 2, which is a little bit weird considering how far above the standard stat line we've gone at both 1 with Hydra Bob and at 3 with something like Gladiator. It's weird that 2s are still like, 2/3 with some upside, but I guess that's just how it is. And so you have this very unique kind of card that tells you to build around it. What I also like is that this is an ongoing ability, because in a world where you want to build a full Victoria Hand deck, you probably want to overlap with Devil Dinosaur a little bit. And if you overlap with Devil Dinosaur, of course, being an ongoing ability, you typically want another target for your Mystique in decks like that. And I think this is a really good target for Mystiques if you're going to be generating enough cards. There's a world where we could go back to like Quinjet Devil Dinosaur type stuff. I'm not saying we're going to go back to Sentinel, but I will say that, playing a 2/5 Sentinel is a lot better, especially if it's a 1/5 because of Quinjet. And I think that generally speaking, I'm very interested in trying to make this card work. I'm not sure it has a direct slot in home the way that Iron Patriot does. Iron Patriot is like, I get this. It goes in a very specific deck that I perfectly understand. I know what this card's role is. It's almost like it was tailor-made for that role. It's going to be very good at filling that role. V-Hand is a little bit different. V-Hand is like a modern Cerebro. It's just a different kind of card where if it succeeds, it will not be by virtue of just fitting in an already existing deck. It will be by virtue of maybe returning an old card to prominence like Devil Dinosaur or creating a new archetype entirely. There is one deck that I think maybe this card goes in and just fits in no matter what, and that would be, of course, the Moon Girl deck. Moon Girl has the synergy with V-Hand in that it is a card that creates other cards. And it's also like, if you have 2 Victoria Hands, suddenly all your other created cards are +4, and that seems really good. Copying Victoria Hand seems really good. You have 1 Victoria Hand giving the buff to the other Victoria Hand. That seems really, really strong if you can get 2 copies of Victoria Hand. Moon Girl is already a pretty good deck with very reasonable point output. I'm interested to see what direction this pushes it, though, because I wonder if that will push it away from She-Hulk stuff and more towards just playing a bunch of 1-drops and Hitmonkey and stuff. But, like, I'm imagining a world where I have 2 of these and my Wasp is just, like, 5 power. And that seems kind of crazy to me. Like, that is a really interesting application of this card. So if I had to say it would have a day 1 home, I would expect that day 1 home to be Moon Girl. But also, I want to see what it can do in terms of reviving, a Quinjet, Devil Dino, Mystique type archetype. It's possible that kind of stuff just can't exist anymore. And that would make me sad because I love the Devil Dino archetype. It's a very fun thing. I think one thing you might understand about me at this point, having watched me long enough, and knowing what I like playstyle wise, a mid-range deck that sort of randomly generates some cards, that's my thing. I really do enjoy it. And so I really would like this card to revive that kind of archetype. I do have the minor worry that it ends up just being Moon Girl goes taller now. And that's really relevant because Moon Girl is already very close to being legitimately elite. And I think that a card that gives it, if this card ends up being like a 210 in most games, we saw what getting a card like a 210 did for Goon Knight with Fenris Wolf. A 210 going in most decks is like completely insane and can really take them over the top. Their point output goes up by some amount per game, and that's a really, really, really important breakpoint to hit, especially when you're a deck that only does points, because if you're a deck that only does points, the only thing that matters is that number, and any card that raises that ceiling is usually a good idea. Next up is Bullseye, with an activate ability that discards all cards that cost 1 or less from your hand at 4/5, and this is where things get weird, for each card discarded, afflicts a different enemy card with -2 power. So what this card wants you to do is like fill your hand up with swarms and then activate on the final turn to discard all of your swarms, and then all of your swarms go away and they come back. Of course, you get like your collector procs, your Morbius procs, but you also just like scatter bomb your entire opposing board. Like you can hit up to 7 things with -2 power. The value prop here does make sense to me, but I do think that there is one major worry that I have for this card, and it's that, okay, let's start with what's good about it. Let's start with what's good before we start talking about what's bad. What's good is that this is a way discard can attack that is not normal. You don't have to use it on the final turn of the game. You can use it for like setup, right? Like you don't have to be like, oh, I'm carpet bombing my entire opponent's board with all these swarms. You can just be like, oh, I'll use it on 5, get a couple extra swarms and a Scorn proc and hit for like 6 and then just play out all my cards. That also makes sense to me, especially if you're still trying to Dracula, but we'll get to that in a second. Now, I do think that this card makes some sense, but there are some pretty significant downsides to talk about. The first is 4 activate is a really specific timing, especially in a deck that already has a card like Dracula that really wants to be played on 4. 4 activate is hard because this is a deck that wants to go Dracula into MODOK. And so Bullseye has to prove itself to be better than either Dracula or MODOK. Or you end up doing something like, Dracula into Bullseye into MODOK. But 4 activates do not have a good pedigree at this point. I think it is reasonable to be skeptical of 4 activates because they're just not cards more often than other cards are not cards. This is because you can't play them on turn 6. There is no world where you're playing a Bullseye on turn 6 and being happy about it. It's literally a 4/5. And so you have this card that has a very brief window to actually be good. You obviously can't play it on turns 1, 2, and 3. You can't play it on turn 6. And so you really only have 2 turns when you can play it in a deck that already has really dedicated, powerful cards that go on those 2 turns. Like, if you think of the discard archetype, turn 4 and turn 5 are the most defined of probably any archetype in the game. Dracula and MODOK. There are few other archetypes where you can just be like, oh yeah, that's my ideal 4/5. And so Bullseye has some really tough sledding to do in terms of justifying himself. Now, what about outside of pure discard? Is there a way where we can just be like a swarm-style aggro deck, strong guy, Colleen, things like that? It's possible. And the upside on this guy is huge. Like, obviously, if you're playing him and discarding 7 cards with him, you're going to have a really massive point output. That's like a potential 19 power. Here's where we get a little more annoyed, though, and it's that they have once again made a card where I am running into the Luke Cage problem. I'm just running into the Luke Cage problem. I keep running into it. I think that there is so much interesting design space with negative power. We've seen negative power used as a downside on cheating energy with Valentina. We've seen negative power used as an upside with stuff like Ajax. We've seen negative power used like this in order to introduce a new angle into a deck that doesn't really already have it. Negative power feels like a mechanic that should be on a lot of cards. And there are ways to add, it's a way to add depth to the game. It's effectively a way of doing damage in Marvel Snap, which was designed in a way where that didn't happen. Like, this is a way of attacking your opponent's board, of making it weaker, of hitting them, basically. It's really cool. It's a really important mechanic in the game. I think it should be more prominent than it is. But it can't be, because of Luke Cage. And the more they lean into this as a good thing to do, which I think it is, I think they are correct in assessing that doing damage to your opponent's board is and should be a more common thing than it is, and is a good thing to introduce into your game. Luke Cage getting rid of all of it is really stupid. It just is. There needs to be some more depth to it, because right now they have a mechanic that has a lot of depth in terms of how you put it on cards. We've seen it in the Valentina form, we've seen it in the Bullseye form, we've seen it in the Ajax form. There's a lot of depth to what this mechanic can do, but playing against that mechanic is reduced to a binary choice of play Luke Cage and you win, don't play Luke Cage and you probably lose. And I think that's just a very unfortunate situation for them to find themselves in, because this is a great mechanic. Not activate, but afflict. Afflict is a great mechanic in a game like this that doesn't have board combat, that allows you to pseudo do board combat, and having one card that's just like, actually, board combat's not real. I think that's bad. Moonstone is a 4/5 ongoing that has the effects of your 1, 2, and 3 cost ongoing cards at this location. Basically, this card is Onslaught for small ongoings. I realize there's going to be people who look at this and they're like, oh my god, Patriot just got so much better. And, yeah, it's probably a buff to Patriot, but I think my ultimate problem with Moonstone is that I don't think they push ongoings in the same way they push other cards. And what I mean by that is, when you think about, like, people love complaining about power creep, right? It's all power creep. It's all, Agent Venom's busted, Surtur's busted, Galactus busted. All the newest card's always busted, right? One archetype that has basically never gotten a new busted card is ongoing. And I wish they kind of did. I mean, like, for all we know, at this point, Victoria Hand could be that. But Victoria Hand's not an ongoing card so much as she is a card with ongoing. When I say ongoing card, I mean, like, a Spectrum deck. And I understand why that decision would be made, but at the same time, I feel like they have so much room to print busted ongoings, because Rogue and Red Guardian and, Enchantress all exist. And I understand that, like, ongoings scale with each other in a way that not a lot of other mechanics really scale with each other, right? Like, it's been a while since we've got a really good card for Wong, too. Like, the last really good Wong card was probably, Sage, maybe, right? I get it. But there is a little bit of awkwardness in my head where it's like, all right, we have these, like, archetypes, the ongoing Spectrum deck, the Wong deck, where it's like, there's very clear counters for Wong. It's, Red Guardian Cosmo. For ongoing stuff, there's Red Guardian, Enchantress, and Rogue, and I feel like that's actually a very safe place to put power. And it feels like instead of putting power in that very safe place, there's been a lot of putting power in stuff that's, like, gated by Shang-Chi or Shadow King, and I don't understand why we're not putting power in stuff that's gated by Enchantress and Rogue when we have so much room to do that, right? So I feel like this card could have been stronger. But then there's one really important reason why basically all the text on here feels like it had to be here. If this card was copying, say, at every location, or even at any other specific location, you would have a recipe for ongoing decks having 2 Cosmos, right? Like, if this card did not have the location restriction, what would be happening is basically you'd have one lane with a Cosmo and an Iron Man and some other stuff in it. And then you'd have this, which would be a Cosmo and an Iron. It'd be really bad. I get it. But I do think that this card, Onslaught for small stuff, is just a little bit too weak, because there isn't anything all that busted for it to copy. Like, yeah, okay, you could copy Patriot. Sure, cool, right? You copy Patriot, and then you play your, you go like Patriot and this, and then you play your Blue Marvel. But it's like, were you losing the games where you did Patriot, Blue Marvel, Onslaught after they all went off anyway? Or were you losing those games to getting your, or Patriot, Blue Marvel, Ultron, I should say? Or were you losing those games to getting your Ultron Alioth? Like, what were you actually losing to in that deck? Were you losing to not having enough points, or were you losing to your opponent has Enchantress, you get your Ultron Alioth, L? Like, it's so much more the second than it is the first here. Like, you're not... The issue with Patriot stuff has never been point output. It's like, it's the world's most predictable deck, your Ultron gets Alioth, and you cry yourself to sleep. And it's like, I don't necessarily see this card fixing that. It's just going to be more numbers. And there are worlds in which that's really relevant. But the issue with all of these decks where it's like, I am going to have the most numbers, where there is like a clear-cut counter to it, is that they probably can't ever be the best deck for a long period of time. Like, they can be the best deck as long as something else is taking the heat, or they can be the co-best deck, or whatever. But if they're the deck that has a target on them, well, they're going to get run over because of the clear counterplay to it. And so I think there's a lot of decks like that, like Zoo, perfectly fine deck. Whenever it's the best deck, it can't be that for long. Even Bounce, we've seen, where it's like, oh my god, Bounce is clearly the best deck. And then you run into like Invisible Woman Killmonger gamers. Remember that? Like, even a deck that is as arcane and hard to counterplay as Bounce still has these dedicated haters. And it is not arcane and at all hard to counterplay any of these ongoing decks. It's actually extremely easy. So I'm worried about this card not making a dent in the metagame. Last up is Ares, a 4/6 that is a masterpiece of design for the reason I'm about to tell you. It's an on-reveal ability where he effectively plays war with the top 3 cards of the deck, and your deck and your opponent's deck, and whoever has the highest total in terms of power is gonna win. And if he wins, he's a 4/12. And if he loses, he's a 4/6. And I just think that's awesome. Like, a 4/6 with 4/12 upside is sort of proven to be a pretty good card. Not Namor, of course, but like Malekith is basically this. And I think that this card could be reasonably good, but there is a kind of downside to it, which is that you can't really disrupt a Malekith with Shang-Chi, and this card does get eaten alive by Shang-Chi. And I think it's really interesting to figure out what this card is actually going to be, because a 4/12, that's amazing numbers. You're very happy with those numbers. A 4/6, you're not happy with at all. And I feel like when this guy becomes a 4/12, he gets Shang-Chi'd, and you're very sad. And I think especially right now, when a lot of people that are going to be playing Shang-Chi are also going to be doing Fenris Wolf stuff, a world where they bring back your 4/12 and then it becomes a 4/18 is not a world you want to live in. Like, this is the kind of card where if your opponent is playing Fenris Wolf and Shangs it, you probably just lose. And I do think that that is a meaningful gate on this guy's actual playability. And I think that's very interesting because it's like, there might be a number where like 4, that number is just so good that getting Shang-Chi Fenris Wolfed obviates it, like that doesn't obviate it, but I don't know what that number is, and it would have to be like a card you play on the final turn of the game, because you don't want to get Shang-Chi on it ever, because however big it is, you just get Shang-Chi Fenris Wolf, you cry. I worry that this is gonna be like, oh, I curved it out, and then it got obliterated, and now I'm sad. But I will say, there's a lot of really interesting Surtur stuff you can do with this, and this guy might end up being a real competitor for that spot in Surtur decks that is currently occupied by stuff like Crossbones. I find it hard to believe that decks like that are not going to win the flip a decent amount of the time. And I think that winning the flip enough of the time is going to be relevant compared to like Crossbones' play restriction. It's possible that it ends up being better than Typhoid Mary instead. There's room for this card. What it'll depend on, I think, in terms of Surtur decks, is how frequently they are actually going to make it hit. I am interested to figure that out, and there's actually a mechanic that I'm not very sure about, which is, what does Scar cost in deck when it's not seeing what's on the board? Because I think that is 6, and that would be very helpful to this card if the Scar costs 6 in deck, but then when you draw it, that's when the things are applied, which I believe is how it works. That could be really important to this card being in that deck or not. All right, so on the whole, I am a big fan of Iron Patriot. I think he has a clearly defined home where he will be good. He is competitive with he is compatible in any good cards 2-drop slot. He is competitive within that good cards 2-drop niche. I think he seems like a card that is going to be very solid, and frankly, a card that people are going to get pretty mad at because it's going to feel hopeless sometimes when your opponent gets that to actually happen. I worry that that could be a snap condition that simply happens too early in some games and just forces people out, and that's a bad thing for the game long term, in my opinion, to introduce too many of those. I also think that the card Victoria Hand is very interesting. I'm a big fan of how it looks like to me. I like what it can do. I like that it goes in Moon Girl. I like that it has a defined home in Moon Girl and then an undefined group of cards that could go with it and create a whole different deck that we don't really have in the current metagame. I am not nearly as big a fan of the remaining cards, though. I think Bullseye has a high ceiling, but also a high mountain to climb in order to make it make sense in a Dracula, MODOK, Luke Cage world. I think Moonstone has too many issues with getting counterplayed very easily. And I also think that Ares, while strong, has a pretty defined Shang-Chi weakness. So what's really going to determine whether or not that card is good is how often it is a 4/12 in the Surtur deck, which can play to obviate that weakness with Armor and Cosmo. As always, I've been KM Best. Let me know what you think about these cards in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.